The liberal media are not so liberal. Journalist John Rentoul and Blairite Ghoul admitted he preferred a Boris Johnson government to a Corbyn one. Now, after the Labour Party wheeled out Tony Blair for an official campaign ad, there were some on Twitter rightly criticised Blairite policies, but the client journalist John Rentoul came to Blair's defence. Now, on screen, you can see a thread of a back and forth between a Twitter user, Truvus, versus John Rentoul. Truvus says, "Shame you didn't think that in 2017 and 2019, alluding to Corbyn when he was leader." But John Rentoul says, "Indeed it is. So you prefer Johnson to Corbyn," Truvus says. "I was not alone, you may have noticed." Now, I kind of personally knew this already, and many of you watching probably knew that as well. What I'm really surprised at is the fact that he openly admitted to preferring a really right-wing, really reactionary Prime Minister to a mild social democrat. I look at the right-wing press and it's incredibly damaging. I'm looking at all the disgusting headlines and stories it puts out to divide communities in order to defend power. However, the BBC, The Independent, The Huffington Post, and of course The Guardian is the epitome of our increasingly terrible, terrible media. Now, The Guardian was never left-wing. I never expected it to be some sort of champion for Corbynism or Jeremy Corbyn himself, but it's supposed to be a liberal outlet which is supposed to champion civil liberties and social progressivism. Now and again, they'll talk about very mildly left-wing policies. They'll say something about inequality, the welfare state. They'll talk about levelling up or the levelling up agenda. But they only do it when it's safe to do so. So before Corbyn and now afterwards, these policy areas are allowed to be spoken of. But this is what makes them the biggest hack, because between 2015 and 2019, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, the paper did nothing but trash him and the party itself. Now, no one was expecting uncritical coverage of Corbyn, but if the supposedly left-wing or liberal Guardian supported some of the policies, some of the visions of what Jeremy Corbyn talked about, a much more egalitarian state, then in those 4 to 5 years, you would expect the paper to critically, but also agree on policy and support the party in general. But these are some of the headlines that they came up with between the 2015 and 2017. Yes, Jeremy Corbyn has suffered a bad press, but where's the harm? Why can't I get behind Corbyn when we want the same things? Here's why. Jeremy Corbyn, is the world ready for his sandals and socks? The liberal pundit class was so threatened by a mild redistribution of wealth and power that it gave up all of its liberal traditions, all of its social progressivism to support a now Prime Minister with a history of sexism and racism, just so they could make sure that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't Prime Minister. Now, it's not to say that because Corbyn is no longer leader, that these liberal media outlets are suddenly left-wing again. They're not. They were never left-wing because they still continue to push some pretty shit takes. Here's a couple of headlines from Simon Tisdall on his ramping up of the war in Ukraine. You can see some of the headlines on the screen now. The epic failure of our age, how the West let down Syria. The West's response to Syria's regime must be military. NATO should talk less and do more, or Ukraine will be torn apart bit by bit. So, despite now and again, The Guardian coming up with something that makes sense and briefly suspending any sensible articles, any sensible policy positions between 2015 and 2019, on the whole, it's still pretty right-wing and it's still incredibly reactionary. But the problem is, as I said before, the way it's dressed up, it's dressed as sensible journalism. And the problem there is that a lot of people are going to take these media outlets as exactly that. Sensible journalism. And it is anything but. This is why we cannot and we must not rely on the mainstream media, because the so-called liberal wing of the media class is incredibly right-wing, pro-establishment, pro-corporate. The important thing is independent media, and we've said this over and over again. Independent media is on the rise, and it's something we really need to rely on. It's something we desperately need to combat the current narratives in the mainstream media and provide a real alternative agenda.